in ethics, voting rights, voting integrity, and campaign finance work. Joining the Common Cause team in January, Sara has been fighting unfair voting restrictions and working to elevate the issue of voter integrity under the Gold Dome and out in the community. During the 2017 legislative session, Common Cause Georgia helped to lead the charge against racial gerrymandering in Henry and Cobb counties. Before joining Common Cause, Sara worked as both a campaign manager and organizer for a variety of issues and candidate-based campaigns. A firm believer in education, Sara has committed her professional life to helping bring the government closer to the people. Sara has both an MA and Bachelor's of Science in Political Science from Clayton State University, where she is still on campus as a part-time faculty member. Sara lives south of Atlanta with her daughters and cats, Izzy and Elvis. Welcome, Sara. Everybody.
How is everybody? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Is this working? Okay. How is everybody?
Right.
Good. Thank you so much for being here. I know it's like a super beautiful day, and it kind of stinks out to come inside, but I promise this will be worth your while. So we already talked a little bit about my bio. Let me ask you this question. Raise your hand if you agree with gerrymandering. Nobody?
In some cases, yeah.
So, surprise, surprise, you have a lot in common with your elected officials here, because none of them agree with gerrymandering, but yet we continue to face it cycle after cycle, census after census, for decades and decades. Now, let me just explain. We're going to watch a little primer video in a minute, but let me just explain redistricting and gerrymandering. So redistricting is the process of drawing voting districts every 10 years after the census, right? We get all the census data, comes back into the state legislature, they draw the wonderful maps that we have, right? Now, gerrymandering is the practice of drawing those districts in a manner that will keep the current political party or elected official in power. So gerrymandering is the reason why we have crazy districts, why we have 82% of our state legislators who ran unopposed last year, 82%. It's because our district lines do not represent the folks that are voting in the districts. And so what we're going to talk about today is how you all can help push some really substantial, meaningful reform at the local level and get involved right here in Columbus and Muskogee County. And if you live elsewhere, same situation. Now, we've already been to, we're in Columbus today, Augusta and Macon as well, and we've had huge turnouts of people who are really, really engaged in pushing reform. So we talked, she mentioned about these bad bills that we had last legislative session that were really egregious, moving whites and blacks in and out of voting districts from literally across the county. We're not just talking about community one street over. No big deal. No big deal. We're talking about big movements of people, minus census data, right? We're still using the 2010 census data, to perform interim redistricting. And you might ask yourself, why would they change districts in the middle of a census, right? That doesn't seem very fair, but they do. And they do it after every 2 years, after every election, they go back in and change the districts. So Henry and Cobb County were the most egregious this past legislative session. Who wants to guess why these two particular districts were picked and wanted to be changed? Anybody want to guess? Exactly. They flipped. Both of those districts are currently being led by Republican chairmen. Both of those districts went for Hillary Clinton in 2016. So it's pretty obvious that they're trying to practice incumbent protection, right? Incumbent advantage, which is why most of them don't have a challenger during the general election. So, and we asked one of the representatives who represents one of the districts in Henry County, we said, so why do you want to change your district lines? And this is kind of, you just changed them in 2015. Why are we changing them again 2 years later? His excuse? I want to be able to represent my hometown. So I said, then move. I mean, that doesn't seem very fair. Well, no, it's fine. I grew up there. They want me to represent them. So you've asked every single one of them, and they've all said yes. That just seemed like a really convoluted reason, but really we knew that the reason was to protect his seat and to keep that particular district red. So I'm sure you are all familiar, hopefully, with this Washington Post beautiful graphic that we have here. And this just shows you sort of, if everything were fair, what it would look like versus a gerrymandering situation. Where you clearly see the last districts here on the right, all kinds of crazily drawn. We have a 60-40 split between the two political parties in this particular district, but yet you've got crazy stuff going on over here that doesn't represent what the population looks like or their interests, right? And that's a big, big issue with gerrymandering. You have, and I know this is the same situation in Columbus, you have folks who are living in communities who are, their votes divided, right? Because they're split, maybe not all the way down the middle, but they're split in some sort of fashion in order to dilute the power of their vote. And so you see this last situation, number 3, where it's not compact. These are not fair districts. You have red winning, but we know that this particular area is made up of 60% Democrats. Does that seem fair? And let's just say, let me throw this out there, hopefully all you know this, the Democrats did this just as badly as the Republicans have. If anybody remembers, Roy Barnes, 2001, came in and he said, let's just take all of this and put it in my office. I'll be the governor and I'll take care of all the districts. And it was like, okay, we'll see what happens. What happens? They get challenged in federal court in 2004 and they're thrown out because they were awful. They were possibly the worst example of gerrymandering, maybe the best example of gerrymandering that we've had in this state thus far. And it's all in order to keep these incumbents in power or political party in power. This handsome guy, does anybody know where the name gerrymandering comes from?
Elbridge Gerry.
Yeah, this is the good-looking guy right here. And we'll watch a video and it'll tell you all about it. But he is, we have him to thank for coining the term gerrymandering. Not so much him, but the media buzz that was around when he did. So let's watch this little primer video and it'll explain a little bit more.
Most people have heard the word gerrymandering once or twice, probably during a presidential election. What exactly is gerrymandering? Essentially, it's the process of giving one political party an advantage over another political party by redrawing district lines. It's like Democrats trying to gain an advantage over Republicans, or Republicans trying to gain an advantage over Democrats. You see, each party wants to gain as many districts as possible so they can do things like control the state budget or set themselves up to win even more districts in the future. So, to understand how this practice began and how it continues today, we must go back to 1812 in Massachusetts. Elbridge Gerry, the governor of Massachusetts, supported and signed a bill to allow redistricting. That is, redrawing the boundaries that separate districts. The catch? The new lines would favor Gerry's own political party, the Democratic Republican Party, which no longer exists. You see, Gerry wanted his party to win as many state Senate seats as possible. The more members of your party vote, the more likely you are to win an election. The new lines were drawn to include roads and areas that would help Governor Gerry in the future. It was so strange looking that someone said the new districts looked like a salamander. The Los Democrat added Gerry's name to the word salamander, and voila, gerrymandering. The process of dividing up and redrawing districts to give your political party an advantage. So how exactly does someone go about protecting their own political party and actually gerrymandering a district? There are successful practices: packing a district and cracking a district. Packing is the practice of drawing district lines and packing in your opponents like cattle into as few districts as possible. If more districts equals more votes, the fewer the districts there are, the fewer votes the opposition party will get. Packing, then, decreases the opponent's voter strength and influence. Cracking is the opposite, taking one district and cracking it into several pieces. This is usually done in districts where your opponent has many supporters. Cracking spreads these supporters out among many districts, denying your opponent a lot of votes. When you have a large number of people who would generally vote for one type of party, those votes are known as a voting bloc. Cracking is a way to break that all up. So when would a party choose to pack their opponent's districts rather than crack them? Well, that really depends on what the party needs. To dilute your opponent's voters, you can pack them into one district and leave the surrounding districts filled with voters of your own party. Or, if you and your party are in power when it's time to redraw district lines, you can redraw districts and crack out the powerful district and spread your opponent's voters out across several neighboring districts. So, Governor Gerry in 1812 wanted to gain an advantage for his party and redrew district lines in his state in such a crazy way with a whole new word and way of thinking about how political parties can gain advantages over their opponents. Politicians think of creative ways to draw districts every few years. So, the next time an election comes around and politicians ask people to vote, be sure to look up the shape of your district and the districts that surround it. How wide does your district stretch across your state? Are all the districts in your state relatively the same shape? How many other districts does your district touch? But always be sure to ask yourself, does my district look like a salamander?
So is that new information for most of you, packing and cracking? If you look at the state map, this is the congressional map here, you can see some very vivid examples of packing and cracking. So the first over here from 97 to 2002 is when the Democrats were in charge and drew the congressional district for the state of Georgia. To the right is when the Republicans were in charge. And now again, these aren't zoomed up because it's super hard to see on a slide, but it gives you an idea of how much these districts have changed. Now, mind you, demographics have changed, right? So we'll give people that. However, not sure that they've changed as much to warrant these big differences, particularly in South Georgia and congressional districts. So you see that crazy lines are pretty much how these things are done, but also long districts. And that's an example, perfect example, of cracking voters in areas who might be a voting bloc. We think of rural areas as a voting bloc, minority communities as a voting bloc. We think of these folks as being communities who need the power of their vote, right? Like everybody else. But as you can see, we've cracked some of those voting blocs, particularly in Middle to South Georgia. So again, we see incumbent advantage. And it shouldn't be any surprise to any of us that only, what do we have, 18% of legislators ran, they actually had opposition. Only 18% state legislators had opposition. So what happens when maps are gerrymandered? We go through redistricting, then they say, the parties look and say, we could pick up some seats, or we could make a difference in these particular areas. So let's change the lines up a little bit, right? In order to keep our party in power. So then what happens? What can the voters do about it? Well, if you remember back in 2011, when our last census was up and they were doing all the drawing of the maps, the leadership from the General Assembly and the Reapportionment Office and the House and the Senate went on a tour, a listening tour, across the state. And they wanted to hear feedback of what people thought of the new district lines. You know what they didn't have with them? Maps. So it was a listening tour, and it was listening only because no one really knew how to digest the information. I'm going to throw out, oh, there's going to be 56,000 people represented in your particular district. Well, that's all fine and well, but most people need some sort of visual to see, well, okay, what does that mean? So am I going to be in the same district I was in before? If I move, is that going to affect me, and how much? Is my neighbor across the street still going to be in the same district, or are they going to change that? And it changes so often that we really feel a big sort of layer of disenfranchisement from voters. Have you ever shown up at your polling place, maybe you've been going to for several election cycles, and they say, oh yeah, you don't vote here anymore. Or you're in the wrong district, they didn't send you a card? Sometimes these things happen so quickly that the local board of elections have a hard time keeping up with the changes. And let's face it, not only is that burdensome on our local boards of elections, but it's also very costly. And that is a cost that is incurred by the county, not by the state. And a lot of times counties can't afford to do it. And so you have somebody running up on a poll at 6:45 right before it closes and saying, I'm going to get my vote in, I just got off work. And they're unable to vote there because their district has changed, their polling location has changed, and they've not been notified. Then what happens? Next cycle rolls around, and I'm probably going to say, well, shoot, I can't chase this all over. I got to go to work. I don't have time to drive to 2, 3 different polling locations. So therefore, your vote is lost, right? And you're probably going to be so frustrated, particularly if you're a first-time voter, that you may say, heck, I'm never going to vote again. This is way too much trouble, it's not worth it, and it doesn't affect me anyways. So gerrymandering has a chilling effect on many different aspects of voting. Let's take a look at this difference between these two maps here. On the left, you see the Republican proposed maps by the Republican House Caucus, and on the right, we've got a nonpartisan, mathematically drawn map of our congressional districts. So again, looking at these, you may say, well, that's not too terribly different. But when you think about it in terms of, let's take CD2, for example. You're cutting out that whole southwestern part of the state. That's a pretty big swath of area that you're now going to lump into 8, right? And maybe I say, you know, I don't have much in common with the people who live in District 8 because I'm 100 miles away or whatever. Sanford Bishop is a really good example of that. He has such a cockamamie district now that it's almost impossible for him to govern because I think, Harry, do you know how many how many counties he has in his district?
Not exactly, but we're talking many cities, including Columbus, south of Macon, Albany to Americus, like that whole wine area going all the way to the border with Florida. So it's pretty wide.
Pretty big district. And, this is not picking on Congressman Bishop, but just making mention that not only is it difficult for the voters who live in that district, but it's also difficult for their elected officials to govern them appropriately and properly. So you see the two differences here in the maps, and we hope the one on the right will be what we can produce in 2021, using some sort of algorithm, using math, in order to draw the districts, versus having hands on it, having human hands. Because humans, we, regardless of party, regardless of your ideologies, it's hard for us sometimes, right? If we want to be in power, we want to stay in power, it's hard for us to be completely and totally 110% honest. Because, that's part of the appeal to running for office, right? So, Common Cause, along with our partners, Georgia ACLU and several other groups, we propose that let math do it. Let a computer do it. And then, of course, humans check over things. But at least we have a basis that's completely nonpartisan, right? And it's something that's based in science and math that we could use. Who knows who drew our state legislative districts in 2011? It's not the obvious answer.
It was a law firm, right?
Exactly. It was a lobbyist firm who happens to be also a law firm, Troutman Sanders in Atlanta. They have over 100 registered lobbyists underneath the Gold Dome. So talk about some conflict of interest issues, right? That's a problem. Now, previously, we had the Carl Vinson Institute out of UGA. They drew the maps. They would draw the maps, hand it over to the legislature, then they would do their gerrymandering thing and vote on it and all that fun stuff. We think there needs to be a public entity, an independent commission comprised of citizens who oversees this process. Just plain old people. Nobody that has a dog in the fight or has any special interest behind changing the districts, but someone who's completely, a group of people who are completely independent of the state government. Because we feel like that's the only way that we'll be able to keep this partisan attitude and these partisan ideas out of the whole redistricting process. Now, has it worked? Yes, it has. California, Arizona, Nevada, Iowa, all use independent redistricting commissions. Very successfully, I might add. One of our favorite stories for Common Cause is to tell the story about Nancy Pelosi, who many years ago fought tooth and nail this whole idea of a Citizens Redistricting Commission. She flat out told Common Cause California, I'm not going to support this. The Democrats won't be in power if we have some sort of independent commission, so I'm not doing this. Well, passed anyways, right, because they had a referendum where they could put it on the ballot. Now, she's possibly one of the biggest champions of the Citizen Commission because the Democrats picked up seats. She said, oh, well, I didn't know this would happen. It's so funny when you actually use population data and you take the human aspect out of it, that people actually feel like that they can vote and that their vote matters. How many times have you thought to yourself, and I know this is true for me, I am a Republican and I live in this super blue district, what's the point in me going to vote? Right? What's the point? I'll just stay home, it doesn't matter. That's the kind of feeling that you get if you come down to the state capitol during the legislative session. You look around, and you hear all these social issues. Religious freedom and abortion and all these things, and think, gosh, don't they have something better to do? I mean, what about jobs, education, these types of things? And you think, man, this state is for sure red, right? I might as well just move. But that's not true. Georgia's almost 50-50 between the two political parties. We're about 46% Democrat. But you would not know that by looking at the supermajorities under the Gold Dome. And we have gerrymandering to thank for that. One of the biggest problems that comes out of gerrymandering is only 10% of the voters actually vote. 9 to 10% of the voters actually vote. Because those are the primary voters, right? And the only real competition is in the primary. So if you're only speaking to 10% of 60,000 people, you're going to get some extreme elected officials in office, right? With some extreme views, either way, left or right, that aren't necessarily going to reflect the interests of your district that you're representing. And that's a big problem. If you're only talking to 10% of the people, that's how we get crazy things like last session there was a bill to create a State Department of Homeland Security. And I said, so where are we getting the money from? And Lieutenant Governor Casey Cagle said, our revenue's growing, we've got money. And I thought, well, that's interesting, because we also need new voting machines, and we also need education money, and we also need, but, Department of Homeland Security is definitely important, right, at the state level. So, let's talk a little bit more about interim redistricting. It doesn't seem like it should be legal, does it? What are we basing this off of? We're basing this off of old information, right? And truth be told, it's probably old within 2 years of the census, but the farther we get away from the census, the older the data becomes. And so these interim redistricting bills that come up every single 2 years after each election pass in the dead of night. No one pays any attention. No one thinks, well, it's okay that Jan Jones wants to live in the same district as the new house that she's building. You know, and I to say to Dad, why aren't you moving? That's what an everyday average person would do, right? I want to represent the district across the town, so I'm just going to move. And what happened this past legislative session is we had less than 24-hour notice. We show up to the committee meeting. The chairman refuses public comment. The bill was passed in 3.5 minutes. The rules of the House were suspended, so it was on the floor the very next day. We literally had no time to try to work up some sort of defense and get people on the phones, calling, and get media involved and all of these kind of things to bring attention to this. When we objected, we were told by the House, well, you know, we kind of go with what our members want to do. If they come to us and they want to change their districts, we just redraw them. But, I mean, that doesn't seem okay. That doesn't seem fair. But we have the beautiful Georgia Constitution that actually gives power to the Georgia legislature to change the districts anytime they think it's necessary. That could be, you know, first week in January when they come back into session. They could say, you know what, we want to change 50 of our legislative districts. So we're just going to do that because we just think it's time. And what happens is there's no public comment. There's no type of transparency lens put on any of this. And so we continue this cycle of gerrymandered districts, disenfranchised voters, and people staying in power that do not represent their district. They don't look like the people they represent. They don't vote like the people that they represent. None of those things. And this is very much true in Atlanta. We have a lot of really solid Democratic districts. It's the same situation, right? There's nobody running in the general against these people, no Republicans running against them because they think they can't win. And so you have someone running in a primary in, you know, April, May of that year who effectively wins the seat, right? Because they don't have any competition later during the general election in November. So part of what we would like to see happen is for us to amend the Constitution in order to outlaw interim redistricting. Unless it's just an absolute, which I can't even think of an example, but a really strange situation where we needed to do something. But doing it every 2 years after an election kind of looks pretty bad. It looks very much like partisan gerrymandering. So the Georgia Supreme Court in 2006 upheld interim redistricting by saying, hey, I mean, the Constitution stipulates that they can do it. So we can't see any fault. And we've got to pass a constitutional amendment in order to change that kind of stuff. So I kind of already talked about this already. This is the court's opinion from 2006 from the Bloom case, excuse me, that says, hey, we as a judicial body can't do anything about this because we are supposed to uphold the Constitution of the state, and the state Constitution gives license to these elected officials to change their districts anytime. And this is probably one of the worst parts about the whole redistricting process in Georgia. Most states have codified laws that say you can't do that. The legislature can't do that, particularly if they're just on a whim, right? Here, yes.
Question: do you have a map of that's a clear simulation that was done for House districts that would reflect more about like about how the population and the voting population would be applied if it were on a non-partisan basis? Would you have a similar simulation for like the state House and state Senate districts as well?
I think there probably are some, but I will have to get back to you on that. Part of what I'm going to share with you all this afternoon too, and which is the reason why I ask everyone to sign in, I'm going to share with you a Google Drive folder that's full of activist things that you can do. Phone scripts, phone numbers, sample op-eds, sample letters to the editor, all kinds of stuff that you can help us to push reform. And so if I can find those, I'll pop them into that folder so that you can see them. This is just a map that we made as Common Cause and some of our partners against the gerrymandering, the redistricting that was taking place this past legislative session. And this is HD 111, which is pretty much the entire county of Henry, which if you know, it's down towards Macon, 75 South. You see, and I know it's super hard to see because it's very small dots, but the difference here, yellow, purple, of white and black voters moving in and out of these districts. Now, if you've ever seen a redistricting piece of legislation, it's just a bunch of census blocks and numbers. It just doesn't really make any, whatever. Doesn't make a lot of sense. When we put this map together and started floating it around, people were very interested. Oh, wow, that's some big changes. Some big, and why are you moving folks of color like that? What's going on there? So the day that the Senate was hearing this bill, the state Senate, we were in the Capitol, and one of the journalists happened to walk by, and I was waving the map, getting all excited. He said, "What is that?" And I said, "These are the changes that the House is proposing to this district." He said, "Oh, give me that. Let me see that." 6:30, it was on the news. The next day we got word that they pulled this district out of the bill. Because Representative Brian Strickland said, "Oh, I didn't realize that that's what was happening." I said, yeah, man, we got you. Here it is, literally in color for you to see the districts and the changing. So, again, this whole bill was brought to the committee with no maps, no discussion about why are we doing this, what's the purpose, what are the current demographics, none of that. It was simply put the bill in front of the committee members with a bunch of numbers and just hope that they vote the right way. And I'm going to give you the stink eye if you don't, kind of thing. So we found that these maps are extremely effective, and the visual really tells the story of gerrymandering and how egregious that it can be. So let's talk about another aspect that's affected our voting here in Georgia, and this is probably one of the hardest challenges that we currently face, and that's the removal of Article 5 from the Voting Rights Act. You are all probably familiar with the 2013 Supreme Court ruling that basically Justice Roberts said, "Hey, there's no discrimination. It's okay. Congress come up with a new formula to determine what discrimination looks like." Well, good luck with that, right? Right, good luck with that. Because Congress has yet to address these issues in states like Georgia and Alabama, and Mississippi, and North Carolina, and many other states, as you can see. We all have a big problem with discrimination. And having another set of eyes on our legislative and congressional district drawing is not a bad thing. It's good to have that check in place. But unfortunately, it does not look like that's going to be returned to us anytime soon. Because even though you say, "Oh yeah, sure, these maps look great," it's kind of comforting to know that the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. is looking over just to make sure that everything adds up the way it's supposed to, and we don't have situations where voters are packed into a district or their vote is cracked and communities are moved in and out and they're not represented well. So we have this removal, as you can see from this graphic, that after the Shelby case in 2013, these are the states that started getting on the bandwagon of really bad voting bills. I'm sure you guys have heard of Georgia having the ID bill, right? They're constantly trying to bring new ID bills up. So you have to have a Georgia state ID in order to vote, right? What if you don't have your birth certificate? What if you're 90 years old and you have no way to get your birth certificate. What happens then? What if you can't afford the $25 to get a state ID in order to vote? Isn't that a poll tax? Doesn't that become a poll tax then? So all of these states have started imposing very strict ID requirements in order to vote. Now, this is a funny kind of side note. You know, the week that this Supreme Court ruling came out, you remember that Paula Deen scandal? Where she had those people in her restaurant that were saying, she's discriminatory or whatever, and it ended up getting shut down. Well, that was a whole racial discrimination case, cost her her career pretty much. Meanwhile, the Supreme Court is saying, there's really not any discrimination in the South anymore. And I'm like, hello? You have probably one of the most influential Southern cooks here that is having this situation. And I just thought, how ironic. But we all know that this is very alive and well in the South still, and that we need these checks on our maps just to ensure that every vote counts. So, racial and partisan gerrymandering, now they're kind of two different things, but the same thing altogether, if that makes any sense. So, partisan gerrymandering obviously is dividing up voters who are who typically vote in the same political party, right? Partisan gerrymandering, we don't have a closed primary here in the state. You don't have to register for one party or the other. We have no database that tracks everybody's partisan affiliation. So partisan gerrymandering is a very hard thing to prove in court. And hopefully we have what Tuesday will be the first case the Supreme Court is hearing on redistricting out of Wisconsin, and hopefully they'll come up with a good decision off that, but we don't feel like that's probably going to be a very good decision because it's based on partisan gerrymandering, which is extremely hard to prove. Whereas racial gerrymandering is much easier to prove, as you saw from the map that I showed a few slides ago. A lot easier to prove. So in states like Georgia, where we don't have to register for party, these legislators are just kind of taking a guess and using a lot of stereotypes while they do that. Okay, so Southwest Atlanta is predominantly minority communities, so that's probably going to be Democrats, right? Or North Georgia and Blue Ridge Mountains, a lot of white people, that's probably Republican. But it makes our litigation cases difficult because they can say, we don't have any way to do partisan gerrymandering. We don't know the way these people vote. So that can't be the truth. So in order to have a very solid case, we usually choose to argue based on racial gerrymandering. Now in the past, Common Cause has not done stuff like this. We typically don't do a lot of grassroots organizing and education on this kind of level. This is the first time we've ever done a statewide tour on an issue to try to educate the public. We typically are found in the courtroom litigating these maps. But because of the way Georgia's system is set up, it's really hard for us to win any of those lawsuits. So we've decided the only way that we can do this is with the public, and by calling on you all to help us push reform and to fight off bad things, bad gerrymandering bills, bad redistricting bills. Yes, sir.
Are you familiar with the red map or the redistricting majority project, which was carried out by the public attorney over the last decade in order to and how it used, since they were saying like this is a lot of guesstimate work, they were using such thing as magazine subscriptions or other like ephemeral subscriptions or something that came in the mail to people to consider how they voted, and then using that in order to redraw maps for state legislature and Congress as well. Are you familiar, or is your organization familiar with that?
Yes, we are. Has anybody heard of that Red Map project? So there, and I think I might have taken it out. There is I found a map that was, I want to say it was 2001. The Republican caucus in the state legislature drew up their versions. Here's the maps that we want to see put into place. And they actually had a website, and it was called thinkmajority.com. And it's kind of like the red state plan, where they said, hey, we know that if we want to regain control, partisan control of the state, that it's going to happen at the level of these voting districts. That's the way that we're going to be able to do it. So I thought it was interesting because that just builds upon that whole idea of gerrymandering and incumbent protection. They know, the Democrats know, everybody pretty much knows, if you are in a safe seat or a safe district, you could be in power for a long, long time. John Lewis is a pretty good example of that as well. His district's been changed several times. I have a feeling they probably continue to vote for him regardless, but his district continuously gets darker and darker blue so that he has a safe seat. Hank Johnson, also out of the DeKalb area of Atlanta, same situation. And there are literally folks who, that wall back there is my neighbor across the street, but that neighbor is in a different district because that neighbor votes a different way or is a part of a different demographic. So, yes, to your point, Harry, and I know this kind of thinking has been going on for many decades, but the Republican Party started in earnest in the late 70s, early 80s with saying, if we want to get in power, this is the way that we're going to have to do it, and this is the surefire way to pick up seats, which is currently why a majority of our states have Republican governors and Republican legislatures. Now again, Common Cause is a nonpartisan organization. Democrats do the exact same thing. But the Republicans saw an opening. And they also saw, sort of, as I've pointed out, loopholes in state constitutions that would allow them to continuously draw these districts to keep their party in power. So very, very, I'm glad that you brought that up. There's another book, too, that I should mention that's very interesting. It's called Rat Effed. Can't say the whole word because we're in a church, but it's literally called that, and it goes through the whole history of how gerrymandering started, why it continues, and how it continues, and what we can do about it. So, racial and partisan gerrymandering are very similar, especially in the state of Georgia, but very interesting. We've got Supreme Court cases, not Common Cause, but Maryland, North Carolina, Wisconsin, that are based upon both of these ideas, racial and partisan gerrymandering.
What was the name of that book?
It's RAT, F-U-C-K-E-D.
That's it? The
No, that's
rats in that? Okay,
Yeah.
I thought I missed part of it. I mean, I got the flute
Just
part.
trying to find the most PC way to, without the lightning coming down. So these are the major issues.
Yeah,
There's no
Unitarian.
possibility of that.
Well,
Unitarian.
I'm safe. You see, these are the 5 ways that gerrymandering can affect us as voters across the state. We've already talked about incumbent protection, but unfair elections is another big thing too, right? There's very much a loss of competition in these districts where someone says, well, I'm a Democrat, but I live in a solidly red district. I really want to run for county commission, but I don't think I'm going to win. And that's not good. We want competition. That's the foundation of democracy, right? Get the best and the brightest to lead the path. That's kind of the idea. There's also an issue, too, with corruption that occurs because people become apathetic and they become disengaged. And they say, I've had this Democratic representative for 30 years, and I still live in the same district, and so what's the point? Why I'm not even going to pay attention because I don't agree with him or her, or, whatever. So that opens up a doorway that can lead to corruption. You all can see how that would happen, right? And just like I was talking about the gerrymandering bill last session, if we aren't paying attention to what's happening in Atlanta, that's where we get all of these crazy cockeyed bills that come out of nowhere in these laws that make no sense, like don't carry an ice cream cone in your left pocket on a Sunday afternoon. Don't do it, or I will turn you in.
Yeah, I'm following your discussion and how districts can be manipulated so that you favor one racial group or a partisan group. But what I'm trying to figure out, well, okay, what's the ideal way to do it then? Because it seems like if you had a state which was divided in geographical squares, up and down, that what would happen is if you had a majority white population, for example, in every one of your districts, the blacks, minority groups would never elect anybody. So gerrymandering could sometimes work in favor of these minority groups because you cut out a slice of the pie where they will at least be able to get a representative, when otherwise, if it were just mechanically divided, they would never have an opportunity. So what is the ideal? That's what I'm missing here, is I know all the things that can be done, manipulated and done wrong, but what is it that we would like to see happen?
That's a good question. So we would like to see some sort of computer model drawing these districts. However, it's very important to remember that our voting districts have to also be compact, right? So generally, if the racial issue, if you're having a computer model do it, you don't have to worry about that quite as much because you're going to have communities of interest are going to stay together because districts are compact. And so you're not splitting these communities of color, communities of interest. You're not splitting their vote in effect. So an ideal situation would be having both races or every race, right, in each of the districts. And not a situation where you had, all Asians or all whites or all blacks. And we posit that if we use a computer model and we put all the data in and we said, this is what we want you to do, then it would spit out something that, yeah, you would have a few districts that would be majority one race or the other. However, it would be much more compact, these districts, and we wouldn't have to worry so much about the racial aspect because we're using a computer model to do this kind of dividing up of people.
So, if you had say a 30% minority population, using a computer model, you'd end up with 30% districts with the minority being represented as opposed to maybe never getting representation or getting over-representation. Is that the way it would work?
Sort of, but it also takes into account, like you were talking about dividing up the state, the region. So like, for example, in Atlanta, where we have a very predominant minority population there, there's, the computer isn't going to be able to do a whole lot, but you can't move whites into the district necessarily if they're not anywhere near. So you're taking into consideration the regions, and still, you're not just saying, computer, we want you to have 30% representation in every district across the state of African Americans, for example. You're saying in each of the regions, in each of the areas, you look and see the demographics, and like Atlanta, using that as an example again, if you know that there's a high population of minority populations, then those people would they would stay together. Does that make sense? It's very, I need to have a computer model to be able to kind of show you how it would work. But when a computer model is breaking down all of the, like for example, in the state house districts, there are roughly 56,000 people in each of those districts, give or take 500. So the computer would look at all of those districts and make sure that no communities of color or communities of interest were divided. But yet it looked pretty, as well as it could be, spread out and represented with every single race. So as it stands now, as Columbus is probably a sort of good example. I'm more familiar with Atlanta and Savannah, but when you have a representative from either party, you know, who wants to stay in power, then you see the lines literally drawn around the communities that they want to represent or they think they'll get reelected from. A computer will just say, no, you know, you're going to represent this whatever 5 square mile area, and everything is equal. Yes.
So I think what he was trying to, and maybe what I'm trying to understand too, is what demographic information is used to make these determinations? Is it based on race? Is it based on gender? How are we deciding what are the demographics that we're going to be using to divide up the state into a representation of what we are? And how is that written into our Constitution, or how is that representative in the laws that govern how they can break this up?
It's not. There's only 2 stipulations in the state constitution for dry districts. One is to follow population, which is the census data that we get. The other is that all districts have to be contiguous, which means, you know, they have to touch, right? They have to be like a whatever shape it is. It has to have all sides and not be interrupted by anything else. So we don't have standards, to your point. The census data comes into the state, though, giving you all that information. The age, the sex, the race, all of that, all the addresses and information that you would need. So you get all of that stuff. But like I said, if I showed you now the district information for like Blue Ridge, you would see it's, you know, pretty white district there. And that's just because that's who lives there, right? So, but all that census data comes in, and they take that all into account when they're drawing districts. Because the Voting Rights Act of 1965 says that it protects the votes of both, you know, women, men, minorities, all of those things. So that all of that demographic information is included when they draw the districts. But sometimes it's impossible to have a more diverse district just because that's the area that you represented within.
But ideally, if you're doing this by computer, you ought to be taking those characteristics out of the picture. In other words, all you ought to be doing is communities that ought to be kept intact. In other words, a community like Hamilton, which is up the road here, ought to be kept intact. It ought not to be divided. If you start throwing in, well, how many women are there, what are the minority counts, you're falling into the same trap that you fell into with gerrymandering. In other words, you're artificially creating the districts in such a way as to lean that way. And what you try to do with gerrymandering, you try to take that out of the picture. You try to make sure that each district has 56,000 people, and it's going to fall where it does. The communities are going to stay intact, but whether or not, you know, you have a disproportionate amount of minorities in there or a disproportionate amount of non-minorities in there is out of the picture.
Well, I think that we leave that data in for a good reason, and that's to make sure protections are afforded to those people who may feel like they're not being represented, just to have like an extra layer, another check, so to speak. Because even if you have a community that's, let's say Columbus, if you have a community like Columbus that you say, hey, we don't want to divide this up, first you have to, right, because Columbus is huge. But you have to put in that information according to the Voting Rights Act of 1965 in order to make sure those underrepresented persons have that protection. So that's like the whole idea behind it. Now I understand your point, and you make a good point, that if it's a community and within reason, let's just do that. Let's just work on population, not worry about demographics, not worry about color of skin or anything like that. But what could potentially happen is you could have areas that are solidly one race or the other that look like they're packed in order to sort of minimize their vote, so to speak. For instance, if Atlanta did that, if it broke into 4 different legislative districts, let's just say, then you would have majority minority communities represented in Atlanta. And those folks who, you know, white people, may feel like their voice has been stifled because they haven't been drawn into districts that maybe encompass other communities, other areas around them that might be white or, Asian or what have you.
I think in essence what a number of people are saying is that what would be the criteria and in what order would it be used to form the algorithm that made up a computer-generated thing?
So let's look at this, because we already have two bills. Actually, they're resolutions because they're both constitutional amendments. One is creating an independent citizens redistricting commission, which we already talked about. The other is laying out standards. So part of the problem that we have here in the state is we don't have any standards in our Constitution. So keeping communities of interest together isn't a part of what they think of or what's happening during the redistricting process. That's not, a conversation that they have. So I know this is really small. Don't worry, you'll all get this presentation. But there are 5 basic things that we're asking to be put into the Constitution that will help kind of alleviate some of these problems. So going back, it has to be contiguous. That's already in the Constitution. Equal population with compact districts where practicable. So where it makes sense, right? Some parts of rural Georgia, you're not going to be able to draw a compact district because you can't ask people to move, right? They're just going to be spread out that way. Districts shall not be drawn to reduce the votes of communities of color. Districts shall not be divided or cracked, like we talked about before. And of course, the partisan, no district should be drawn in a way that favors either political party. So these are pretty, extensive and a lot to ask, really. But we feel like that these are the most important things that lead to gerrymandering, lead to the problems of gerrymandering. I'm pretty sure it's the same in Columbus, but we definitely have a situation in Atlanta where we've got districts running North Atlanta all the way down to past the airport. And that cracks these communities because someone, and I live near the airport, I have very different needs than someone that lives up in the Buckhead area, let's say, of Atlanta. They may want to see economic development. Well, I just want my roads paved. And so that makes it really, really hard. So we feel like, and this is Senate Resolution 7. This is also in the folder that I'll be sharing with you all. Resolution 6 and 7. 6 is, again, the Independent Redistricting Commission. That kind of gives you a breakdown of the members. But these two, we feel, are very, very important, but they're kind of like the golden goose, if you will. They are absolutely, in a perfect scenario, what we would have right now, what we could get passed. However, we've had many Democrats and Republicans tell us that they don't want to support a constitutional amendment. So we've gone back to the drawing board, and we're now going to put forth a package of 3 bills that mostly address the concerns of standards, not so much an independent commission, because that will definitely require a constitutional amendment, but asking them, can we have some kind of guide in place? And that also helps us from the litigation standpoint, too. If Jane Doe feels like that she's been disenfranchised by the new voting district that she lives in, now we, as a litigation strategy, can look and say, okay, well, you've kind of violated these 2 standards that are now a part of law. So we have a leg to stand on in a court. I'm sorry, you've had your hand.
I'm assuming the contiguous requirement couldn't be satisfied by drawing a strip 20 feet wide and 20 miles long. But what does contiguous mean?
Contiguous means that the district has to touch at all points. It has to be basically like a solid line all the way around it. Imagine.
Like just hypothetically, if you were going to draw 2 different districts, just divide the state into 2 different districts, you couldn't make one Atlanta, Columbus, and Savannah, and the other district everything else.
But could you link them with a narrow strip to go around the contiguous requirement?
Yes.
Did it mean nothing?
Yes. I have this gentleman who lives, he's a former MIT professor, so he gets really into this kind of stuff, and he took me for a drive through his district, and he's north of Atlanta, Gwinnett County, North Fulton. And so we're driving, and he said, I got to show you the part of my district that isn't contiguous. And I was like, okay, this ought to be interesting. So we drive to the Chattahoochee, get out of the car, and he says, look at that bridge. And there was a bridge that had to be 50 years old, and it was halfway into the water. It had fallen off. And he said, I've called the legislature and I've asked them, this isn't contiguous. This isn't a contiguous district. You have a bridge and it's on the edge, and it's not, you can't get from one side of the district to the other. So the reapportionment office told him that all he needed to do was to drain the Chattahoochee, and that would make his district contiguous.
You can make the district contiguous by drawing the boundary line up one side of the road and down the other side of the road. They do this in Meriwether County, Pine Mountain. The way they allow liquor sales in Callaway Gardens in a dry county. They run it up one side of the road and down the other side of the road, out into the area that they want to have included.
Remember the case of the former Representative Kareem Brown of Florida? Her district was a majority minority district in Florida, but it was the way that redistricting was done, and it led to a lawsuit that forced a change in the board of this district. It was designed to to follow literally the path of the St. Johns River that goes into Jacksonville, and that was so slim that it wasn't even a gerrymander; it was a jerry snake. So it was literally a snake on the river, and that was all her district. So that I don't know if that would even be considered contiguous. It was just it was so slim that it was barely representing anything. But that was the part that they said, oh, this is majority minority, so you can have it. I think she's in prison now for corruption. Yeah.
Hopefully unrelated to the gerrymandering, but it would be related.
Right.
Yeah, these districts are very interesting, and to answer that yes, your district is contiguous because you can drain the Chattahoochee River is a little absurd, right? And clearly, while he may have kind of a far-fetched point about this bridge, he's saying, hey, we've only got 2 stipulations in our state constitution. We should at least abide by them both, right? And so, very interesting situation. But just so you all know, this is our, again, nothing is perfect, right? Nothing is exactly how we want it. But this is the breakdown of the 14 members who would be a part of the Independent Redistricting Commission. Again, these are non-elected officials, regular, common people, common voters in the state who would oversee and give recommendations about the new maps. So ideally, we would like this to be on the 2018 ballot for voters to vote on next November. And so we could have something in place by 2021, which is the next time they'll be drawing these districts. However, no political party wants to take this on. The Republicans, I've tried to meet with the Speaker of the House probably for 6 months, and he keeps coming up with creative ways to avoid me, and the Democrats are the same way. The Democrats said, well, we're going to be back in power one day. We don't have any interest in tying our hands. So, my answer was, well, what day is that so I can mark it on the calendar? I'll come back and ask you. I mean, we see this as an issue of all voters and protecting all votes, regardless of political party, and making a much more robust democracy while we're at it, right? Because people feel like, well, my vote counts, or I want to run for office, and I might actually have a shot at winning. So those are all positive outcomes to having this change. So let's just quickly talk about how we push reform. So there's 2 things that we really need help with. One is the defensive work. These bad gerrymandering bills that come are call to actions. If you signed up on the sign-in sheet, I have your email, and so we'll send you out calls to action. Call these people you saw on your handout if you picked one up. Tell them, hey, no, you can't do this. Stop these bad bills. But we also need help pushing reform. And part of the ask that I have for you all this evening is to pass local redistricting commissions, independent redistricting commissions. And people are like, okay, what does that mean? Well, the county commissions, the city council, the board of education, which if you don't know is probably the most powerful group in your locality, we need to be independently drawing those district lines. You guys have a lot of at-large seats here. At-large seats are no bueno, right? Because you're not having someone who's representing you. You might as well, in a city council situation where you have an at-large seat, you might as well be mayor if you're serving at-large. Which is very inefficient for the people who are being governed and the person who's the elected official trying to do the governing. So we have identified the issue. Nobody likes gerrymandering, right? We know that that's bad. Fair districts are good. So I encourage you to go take the information, take the activist toolkit that I'm going to give you, and go talk to people. Part of the issue with redistricting and why it doesn't maybe resonate as some of the other more popular, sexy issues is that people feel like it's policy heavy. Oh, what does gerrymandering mean? I don't care about that. I just go vote. We need to be this needs to be a kitchen table conversation. If you've ever asked yourself, how did we get this elected official? How did we get Trump in office? How did we get Obama in office? How did we get so-and-so in office? It's maps. It's your voting maps. It all comes back to voting maps. So by having these conversations in every circle that you possibly can, then we educate people on the fact that this voting districts, this is the foundation of democracy, right? And if those are unfair, then your democracy's rigged from the get-go. Then what does it mean to win? What does that look like? I talked about these constitutional amendments and having standards about redistricting put into law. All of that is extremely important. But really the win is protecting the vote of every single Georgian, regardless of where they live, regardless of how they feel about issues, but making sure that they have as much of a vote as I have, as you have, that we're all being protected through the process. So let me open up this folder, hopefully it will open, and show you some of the tools that I've put in here for you all. Yeah, it did. So as you can see, this is a pretty, I've tried to be, I'm still adding stuff to this all the time because I find something that I want to include. But there's talking points. There are sample resolutions to propose in your local government. There's one sample resolution that encourages your local government officials to put pressure on the state legislature to end gerrymandering. Then there's another that says we want to push for our own independent redistricting commission to make sure that local elected officials are accountable to the people that they represent. Again, going back to the whole at-large. Does anybody know why we're moving to so many at-large seats in these localities?
Because when you don't, I guess my conjecture would be, if you're campaigning for at-large instead of campaigning for a specific district, then you don't have to answer as much to that district or their concerns or their economy. You can just answer to the whole city and basically, that's what.
It makes it much easier for these elected officials to hide, right? Because instead of governing 50,000 people, they're governing 250,000, and that's a real easy way to blend into the scenery and not be noticed and not be held accountable. Particularly for Board of Education members. They are the most powerful group in your locality because they control so much money. And at-large seats for Board of Education is not fair. Not fair at all. Not fair for any level of government, but especially Board of Education seats.
Just to mention too, speaking of the at-large, last year, Sara Henderson, he's one of the two at-large posts, and he's been in that same office since 1996. And he just announced that he's running for mayor next year too. So he'll be, he's benefited from that, and I remember, like, he last appeared, another candidate who wanted to go up against him, Attorney Teddy Reese. And he wanted to, like, of course, Sara Henderson is kind of reflective of that old guard that now wants to become the leadership in Columbus as well.
And that's another thing too, it gives at-large candidates an unfair advantage if they want to run for higher office. Because here they've been able to build name ID and recognition, a lot broader swath of people than just maybe their particular area that they would normally have represented had it been an actual district versus an at-large seat. So again, going back to this information here, these resolutions, we have Senate and House information. I've included an entire statewide list of media contacts. If you're a writer or if you just have extra time, you don't maybe like to talk on the phone as much, write an op-ed. I've got templates in here. Write a letter to the editor. Someone said, I feel kind of weird putting my name on this. It's for you. We wrote this to help you all. Feel free to change whatever information. These are all templates for you to use, but this is important enough that we need to be getting it out there and in front of as many people as we possibly can. Because 2020 is really upon us now. And we're going to have enough problems getting every single person counted in this upcoming census that we need to continue to drive home the idea of fair districts, because if we don't count everybody, then they're not going to be fair. That's impossible. So I've also put in here, a report this at the bottom here. That's a report on a lot of different states and their redistricting systems that Common Cause put out about a year ago now. And it's just interesting background information that will also lend itself well to talking points and whatnot. I've put the legislation in here. There's a phone script. There's an email script. And our flyer here that's on the back is also in here. So I encourage you, and I'll again send this out to everybody that signed up on the sign-in sheet, to take a look at the information and help in any way that looks. I mean, to me, and one of the goals of this tour is to find 5-6 people in each locality who are willing to push these local reforms. Because our thought is, and we've seen this work in other states, if we can push this at the local level, then we can raise the visibility of the issue to the state level and put more pressure on those legislators to act in good faith when they're drawing these voting maps. And we know that you see your local elected officials a lot more than maybe you see your state elected officials or your member of Congress, right? Probably go to Kroger or Walmart. Well, in a perfect world. Right? Might go to the grocery store and run into Teresa Tomlinson. I don't know how available she is, but local folks usually are a lot more receptive to listening and accepting ideas and new ways of doing things, and it helps us to apply more pressure to the state legislators. This past session, the reason why we were able to defeat HB 515, which was the bad gerrymandering bill, was because of people like you. We asked Indivisible, we asked Georgia 159 Together, the ACLU, everybody that we could think of to call these legislators and say, hey, I'm not okay with this. And by the way, why are you using my money to do this? Why aren't you doing something, about our infrastructure or about our education or about things that actually kind of matter to Georgians? So we were able to get that bill pulled. We waited until 2 o'clock in the morning on the last day of session. They finally gavelled out without calling the bill. And we all kind of stood there like, are we sure it's over? Mm-hmm. We don't want to leave until we know it's over. And we all ran out of the building, get home, it's over.
Are we free to share this information with any friends?
Yes. The link that I'll send you will be shareable. This is all public. All of these files are public. You share it with anybody that you think might benefit from it. Adapt it to anything that you might want to use it for. It's there. And it also, if you have suggestions about how to make it better or something that you think is missing, let me know. because I want to continuously add, so this will be sort of a one-stop shop for activism on this issue.
So do you have a link to go to find a map that you can zoom in on and find your district?
I have a...
There's a find your representative link that you can type in your address, and it will show you the map of your district. So when you zoom in here in Columbus, you can see the lines clearly between the third and the second. You can see the clear little gerrymander. But people, like you said earlier, people don't know what district they live in, especially in the state, rules of the state.
Right. Could you, and this is for everybody too, there's some of my business cards back on the table. If you wouldn't mind sending me that link, I would love to include it, because that's really interesting. I would like to do that. A lot of, I think this is the Open States link to find your elected official. Open States is pretty good, but there are probably better ones out there that we could use. But yeah, people just don't know. I mean, it seems already so burdensome, the whole process of registering to vote and to going, you know, I'm just going to vote straight party, or, you know, half of the offices are running unopposed, so I'm just not even going to vote for those people, or what have you. So knowing your district and who represents you is even more, you know, kind of out there for most people. I know when I ask my students, and of course, you know, they're younger, most of the people, they don't know who the vice president is. You know, I mean, they didn't know who Joe Biden was, and I was like, he's been there for 7 years, you know, how do you know? Well, I don't know, I know who Obama is, because he's on every channel, he's, you know, everybody sees him. We would start to break down and get lower and lower, and they were like, wait, we have a House of Representatives in the state? I would be like, oh, job security, right? But, you know, it's unfortunate, but that's sort of how our electorate is. But also, I see a few younger folks, but if you know any people who are younger, I really would encourage them to get involved also. We're seeing a lot of, you know, under 30 running for these local offices, which is fantastic. And it would be great to have them really pushing these types of issues to make sure every vote is protected. And we're trying to go to some different college campuses and talk to them as well, but my budget for free pizza is pretty minimal, so it's hard to get in. Nobody wants to come unless there's food, right? Anybody have any other questions that I can answer for you?
I did have one question. The commission that would be serving to redraw the districts, how would they get in that position? Is it elected? Is it appointed? Who would appoint them?
Good question. So those are appointed positions, not by the legislature, but by political parties for Republicans and Democrats. Then I believe the Supreme Court appoints the 4 who are nonpartisan, and then also the Supreme Court reviews all 14 names. So, for instance, if Jane Doe maybe wasn't registered to vote or hadn't voted but got nominated to be a part of this commission, she probably wouldn't make it. The Supreme Court would go back through and look over the names and make sure everybody was legitimate who was on there. And also making sure no one had either served in elected office ever in their life or was currently in elected office or planning to run. Another thing that also disqualifies somebody from sitting on the commission is being an employee of the state, which I think is important too, right? Even though we have these federal laws that protect partisan, state employees, federal employees for participating in partisan practices, we know that it still happens, right? If I work for Governor Deal and I want to keep my job, I'm certainly probably not going to, want to go against his wishes, and same is true probably for all levels, so. Question. Anybody else? Well, thank you again so much. If you'd like to join our mailing list, I know I have your email, but we have national office also sends out a lot of calls to action. This week, like I mentioned, the Guilford case will be heard in the Supreme Court, which is out of Wisconsin, and they've put together all kinds of action activities around that. So commoncause.org. If you're interested in going to our state page, it's commoncause.org/Georgia. And if you feel so inclined, if you want to become a recurring donor to us, we would love that. All of our money goes right back into state programs. I'm the only staffer here in the state, so I joke that I'd love to hire someone else at some point to, so I don't have to clone myself. I'd also like to echo Indivisible's ask for any donations that you might to help the cost here. We thank the church so much, Bill, for having us. And of course, Carolyn has just been absolutely wonderful. You all have a great leader here. Thank you so much, and please take my information and be in touch, okay?